In the high-stakes arena of the South China Sea, where international tensions simmer just below the surface and global powers quietly flex their military might, a single aggressive maneuver nearly pushed the world one step closer to chaos, when a Chinese fighter jet flew dangerously close to a U.S. Navy destroyer, violating international flight safety norms and triggering a global reaction that Washington will not forget anytime soon. It was early morning when the USS Preble, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, was conducting routine freedom of navigation operations FONOPs in contested waters claimed aggressively by Beijing but recognized by the international community as open seas. Surveillance radars on board the Preble picked up high-speed aerial movement, and within seconds, combat systems went a full alert. What they saw next was a PLA-J-16 multi-role fighter jet screaming across the horizon, rapidly descending to a dangerously low altitude, barely 150 feet above sea level, buzzing past the destroyer at supersonic speeds in a clear show of force. This wasn't just a flyby. This was a deliberate act of intimidation, a reckless attempt to provoke the United States in international waters. The shockwave from the jet's afterburners shook the deck as sailors scrambled to secure equipment. Officers on the bridge immediately sounded readiness protocols, and defensive systems were armed, not to engage, but to show China that America was more than ready if things escalated. Beijing may have thought this intimidation tactic would make the U.S. back off, but they grossly underestimated the backbone of the U.S. Navy. Within minutes, the Preble's crew was in full operational posture, tracking the jet's return path while alerting the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and regional allies. American reconnaissance assets in the area were activated, including carrier-based E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft and P-8 Poseidons, which quickly began monitoring Chinese air activity. Tension surged even further when the PLA Air Force deployed additional fighter jets to the vicinity, essentially swarming the area with military presence in a bold attempt to assert dominance. But the United States was prepared. Less than an hour later, F/A-18 Super Hornets from a nearby carrier strike group launched into the skies, establishing a defensive air perimeter and making it clear that the U.S. Navy would not be intimidated by close calls or dangerous provocations. For the American crew, this was not just about protecting a ship. It was about defending freedom of navigation, international law, and every other allied nation that depends on stability of open sea lanes. Defense analysts worldwide weighed in on the incident, calling it one of the most dangerously close encounters in recent years. Footage leaked from onboard cameras aboard the USS Preble shows the Chinese J-16 slicing through the air just meters above the ship's superstructure, a maneuver so close it could cause a mid-air collision with devastating consequences. The Pentagon swiftly condemned the action, calling it an unnecessarily aggressive and irresponsible display of aerial recklessness that endangers regional peace and the lives of our sailors. Meanwhile, the White House issued a formal diplomatic protest, summoning Chinese military attaches and demanding an explanation for what it called a serious breach of safe conduct at sea. China, in turn, defended the maneuver as a warning against foreign provocation, but the international community saw through the bluster. Naval experts have emphasized that such stunts risk sparking miscalculations that can escalate into full-blown conflict. And for the United States, this latest incident only strengthens its resolve to maintain presence and partnership in the region. Following the flyby, the U.S. Navy doubled down on patrols, with an increased number of destroyers and support ships conducting operations near the Spratly and Paracel Islands. Satellite imagery also revealed a notable uptick in aerial surveillance, as Global Hawk drones and other ISR assets maintained near-constant watch. The message from Washington was loud and clear. The skies and seas of the Indo-Pacific will not be handed over through intimidation or force. And while China may believe bold tactics like this earn them leverage, what they're really doing is galvanizing a coalition of nations tired of coercion. Japan, Australia, the UK, and even smaller Southeast Asian nations voice support for the U.S. and condemn the flyby as reckless. In Washington, military leaders met with urgency, revisiting protocols for aerial engagement and increasing joint training exercises with allies in the region. Soon after, a powerful joint naval exercise unfolded in the Philippine Sea, involving the U.S., Australia, and Japan, sending an unmistakable signal to Beijing. Fighter jets from multiple nations soared in formation, Aircraft carriers steam side by side, and the waters roar with the power of united resolve. Meanwhile, the crew of a USS Preble carried on their mission, heads held high, knowing that their calm under pressure had helped avoid what could have been a catastrophic international incident. For them, it was just another day at sea, another reminder that freedom is never free, and that peace, while always a goal, sometimes depends on the courage of those willing to hold the line. As the Chinese jet disappeared over the horizon that morning, it left behind more than just turbulence in the air. It left behind a wave of consequences that would ripple through diplomacy, military planning, and global geopolitics for weeks to come. And while Beijing might consider its close call a show of strength, the world saw something very different. Recklessness that could have triggered war, met with unmatched American resolve and professionalism of a Navy that does not flinch under pressure. Because when it comes to protecting the peace and preserving freedom of navigation, the United States does not play games. And anyone flying too close to challenge that truth is making a very big mistake. The situation was intensifying by the second as the Chinese fighter jet roared across the Pacific sky, banking aggressively toward the gray steel silhouette of the U.S. Navy destroyer cutting through the waves below. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, a powerhouse of American naval dominance, was on routine patrol. Yet in today's volatile global climate, routine had become a relative term. Radar operators on board the destroyer have been tracking the incoming bogey for several minutes, eyes locked on monitors, hands hovering near defensive systems, tension hanging thick in the Combat Information Center. The pilot of the Chinese J-16 fighter jet, no doubt aware of international airspace boundaries, continued his provocative maneuver, skimming uncomfortably close to the U.S. ship in what could only be described as a reckless display of aerial brinkmanship. The ship's crew, highly trained in threat recognition and response, remained calm but ready, knowing full well that in moments like these, even a minor miscalculation could spiral into an international crisis. Electronic warfare teams quickly scrambled to jam any potential target lock signals, while the ship's commanding officer ordered the crew to condition one: combat readiness. Across all decks, the ship's phalanx CIWS system rotated into active tracking mode, quietly humming like a coiled snake prepared to strike. The message was clear. The United States Navy would not be intimidated. Overhead, the skies bore witness to a confrontation fueled by rising geopolitical tension, with China pushing boundaries and the U.S. standing firm. This wasn't just about one aircraft and one destroyer. This was a microcosm of the broader power struggle playing out in the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese jet banked hard left, then right, tauntingly close, its twin engines blazing with afterburner as it traced a path of provocation over the ship's flight deck. But the U.S. crew was unfazed, trained to operate with cool precision under pressure. On deck, sailors watched with quiet intensity, some filming the encounter on handheld devices for intelligence assessment and documentation, others ready to spring into defensive posture. What China likely didn't expect was that this U.S. destroyer wasn't just any ship. It was accompanied by a carrier strike group just over the horizon, and the Chinese pilots' actions were not only being tracked, but also analyzed in real time by American AWACS, an aerial refueling aircraft miles away. One misstep, one radar lock, one signal flare could have triggered a chain of escalation that the world could ill afford. But the Chinese pilot eventually peeled away, perhaps satisfied with the intimidation attempt, or realizing he was seconds from sparking something far more dangerous than a flyby. The destroyer's crew didn't celebrate or relax. They maintained vigilance. After all, in today's world, the next threat could appear without warning. In Washington, D.C., satellite feeds and encrypted communications relayed the encounter to the Pentagon, where senior defense officials monitored the provocation with grave concern. The message from the U.S. was immediate and unambiguous. Freedom of navigation in international waters is non-negotiable, and any attempt to coerce or intimidate American forces will be met with appropriate response. The incident sparked renewed calls from lawmakers and defense analysts alike to bolster deterrence in the Pacific, citing this as the latest example of China's increasingly aggressive posture. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, intelligence briefings outlined the strategic significance of the encounter, not just as a one-time flyby, but as part of a broader pattern of military coercion in the South China Sea and beyond. The U.S. Navy's presence in these contested waters is not merely symbolic. It is strategic, signaling that the global balance of power will not be shifted through intimidation. The bravery and discipline of the destroyer's crew serve as a reminder of the professionalism and resolve of America's armed forces, standing guard on the edge of peace and war. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the ocean in hues of orange and crimson, the destroyer continued its patrol, silent, powerful, undeterred. This was not just a mission, it was a statement. And while the world may not have heard the roar of that Chinese jet, the message from America was deafeningly clear. Back down or face the consequences. The Chinese fighter jet's withdrawal may have marked the end of the immediate encounter, but for the men and women aboard the U.S. Navy destroyer, the tension lingered long after. Debriefings were swiftly conducted as intelligence officers reviewed sensor data, communication logs, and visual recordings to piece together a full picture of the confrontation. Every detail mattered. What altitude was the jet flying? How close did it come? What electronic signatures were detected? These were not just idle questions. They formed the basis of an operational profile to better understand future Chinese tactics. In a world increasingly defined by near-peer competition, each maneuver, each provocation, adds to a growing ledger of risk. And with both nations possessing world-class militaries, the stakes couldn't be higher. Back at the Pentagon, analysts correlated the data with regional satellite imagery, noting a sharp uptick in Chinese aerial activity in the vicinity of U.S. naval operations. The pattern was unmistakable, a slow, calculated strategy by Beijing to normalize aggressive posturing while simultaneously testing the resolve of American forces. Meanwhile, in the Situation Room at the White House, National Security Council members convened with the president and top military advisors to assess the political and strategic ramifications. This wasn't just a military matter anymore. It was a geopolitical signal flare. News of the encounter spread rapidly, with major outlets broadcasting video snippets of the close pass. Public sentiment ranged from outrage to admiration as Americans watched their sailors stand firm under pressure. The footage quickly went viral, and debates erupted online about the future of U.S.-China relations. Diplomats issued formal complaints, while military attaches from both nations engaged in tense exchanges. Despite official denials from Beijing downplaying the event, insiders knew the truth. This was a test of resolve, and America had passed it. Across the Pacific, U.S. allies watched closely. In Tokyo, Seoul, and Canberra, defense ministries held their own briefings. The encounter was yet another validation of the shared concern about China's military assertiveness. As a result, joint training exercises were proposed and fast-tracked. From carrier group deployments to trilateral air defense drills, America and its allies began reinforcing the regional security architecture. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, the incident fueled bipartisan calls for increased defense spending, especially in the Pacific Theater. Senators demanded acceleration of next-generation weapons platforms, enhanced missile defense systems, and expansion of the U.S. Navy's forward presence. For many, this single encounter illustrated a broader truth. Deterrence is not a relic of the Cold War. It is a necessity in an age of resurgent great power rivalry. Yet beyond the corridors of power and the strategy rooms, the human side of the story remained equally powerful. Interviews with sailors aboard the destroyer revealed a mix of nerves, pride, and resolve. Some spoke of the adrenaline rush, others of the sobering reality that war was just a decision away. These were not just faceless operators. They were sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers putting their lives on the line in defense of global stability. Their calm under pressure was a testament to rigorous training and unshakable commitment. It reminded the nation that peace is often preserved not by words, but by the quiet strength of those willing to defend it at sea, in the air, and beyond. As the destroyer sailed into the night, a symbol of enduring strength, new orders were transmitted. The ship would continue its patrol, now joined by other assets, including a U.S. Navy cruiser and surveillance aircraft flying high above. This wasn't just routine anymore. This was a mission renewed in purpose. The message to any adversary was unmistakable. The U.S. will not be intimidated. The oceans do not belong to any single power, and freedom of navigation remains a cornerstone of international law. Even as the sun rose over the horizon, casting golden rays across the ocean. The memory of the close encounter remained fresh. Onboard briefings emphasized vigilance, and young sailors exchanged knowing glances. They had faced down a threat and stood their ground. Back home, Americans across the country awoke to headlines that reaffirmed a truth many have forgotten. The seas are contested, the skies are not always friendly, and peace requires strength. In classrooms, homes, and offices, the story of the U.S. Navy destroyer and a provocative Chinese jet inspired conversations about duty, courage, and preparedness. Veterans weighed in with stories from decades past, drawing parallels to Cold War standoffs and Gulf encounters. Analysts dissected every frame of the footage, pointing out wing angles, heat signatures, and evasive patterns. And somewhere in the halls of Beijing, strategists surely reviewed their own footage, asking themselves if the provocation had succeeded, or merely awakened the sleeping giant of American resolve. In the end, this incident wasn't about a single jet or a lone ship. It was about global security, the importance of rules-based order, and the courage of those who defend it. The destroyer, now a quiet guardian of the sea, continued on its course, not seeking conflict, but never backing down from it. This is the American way, firm, focused, and always ready. For those watching, the message could not be clearer. In an age of rising uncertainty, there are still forces that stand unwavering in the storm. And the next time a fighter jet dares to fly too close, it will be met not with fear, but with the resolute presence of a nation that never turns away. The tense standoff between the Chinese fighter jet and the U.S. Navy destroyer was far from over. The sea roared below like a wild beast as the Type 052D destroyer Yinchuan crept along contested waters of the South China Sea, shadowing the American vessel with unnerving proximity. Tensions climbed with every passing second, and the roar of jet engines slicing to the skies grew louder. This wasn't just about territorial disputes anymore. It was a deliberate act of intimidation. Suddenly, the skies above the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Mustin buzzed with life as another Chinese J-16 fighter tore through the air, banking dangerously close in a tight turn. The maneuver was aggressive, risky, and screamed defiance. The American sailors aboard the Mustin stood at full alert, eyes fixed on the hostile aircraft trajectory, while CIC, Combat Information Center, tracked every movement. From the bridge, the commanding officer issued a warning to crew: remain calm, maintain course, and do not engage unless fired upon. The order echoed to the steel belly of the warship, a reminder of both discipline and dominance. In Washington, D.C., Pentagon officials monitored the incident via real-time surveillance. Satellite feeds and P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft painted a crystal-clear picture of the unfolding drama. Analysts leaned in as a Chinese jet closed the gap again, this time flying directly in front of the Mustin's bow at low altitude, causing waves to erupt in its wake. It was a blatant attempt to provoke, to challenge the rules-based international order that the United States had vowed to uphold. The USS Mustin's radar operators fed targeting data into the Aegis combat system, fingers inches from launching defensive countermeasures, should the situation escalate. But restraint held firm, for now. Meanwhile, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command raised the readiness level of nearby naval and air assets. Two F/A 18 Super Hornets aboard the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan were launched to provide overwatch, streaking through the sky to ensure that no harm would come to their brothers in arms below. These jets, armed and fueled, with the embodiment of American air superiority, a warning flare across the geopolitical sky. Their arrival in the airspace was a silent yet thunderous declaration. The U.S. does not stand down. Back on the Mustin, sailors braced as the J-16 made another pass. This time, it banked upward, its twin engines leaving a scorching vapor trail as it screamed into the stratosphere. The pilot, likely under orders from Beijing, was dancing on the edge of international provocation. Yet in doing so, he also awakened a beast. The U.S. Navy responded not with a shot, but with strategy. Moments later, a P-8A Poseidon aircraft began relaying encrypted messages to other American assets in the region, calling in support from the guided missile cruiser USS Shiloh and several littoral combat ships already conducting freedom of navigation operations. A coordinated web of strength formed in the South China Sea, American steel cutting, through contested waters with purpose. At the diplomatic level, the White House issued a stern condemnation of China's reckless maneuver. Press secretary statements were broadcast across major networks, urging global allies to recognize the increasing threats posed by aggressive Chinese military actions in international waters. Defense analysts filled the airwaves, breaking down the danger of such close encounters. "This isn't just about posturing anymore," one retired admiral said. "This is a calculated move to test the resolve of the United States and its commitment to freedom of the seas." As tension simmered, China's Ministry of Defense released its own propaganda, claiming the U.S. Navy was a provocateur. But international maritime law told a different story, and global allies began voicing support for America's presence in the Indo-Pacific. Japan deployed destroyers in solidarity. Australia offered reconnaissance support. Even the UK rerouted a carrier strike group to the region. It was becoming clear this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a global flashpoint. On board the USS Mustin, sailors didn't flinch. They had trained for this moment 1,000 times. Damage control teams ran drills below deck. Missile technicians double-checked every component of the Standard Missile 6 launchers. The chief petty officer stood with binoculars in hand, watching the horizon not just for threats, but for confirmation that America's allies were drawing closer. In the skies above, the 2F divided by a -18S flanked the Chinese J-16 from a safe distance. Though rules of engagement prevented immediate retaliation, they flew with power and presence. The message was clear. Every inch of American airspace and every foot of ocean around their vessels would be defended without hesitation. Back at the Pentagon, this incident became a scenario for the war games shaping future doctrine. Commanders studied every move, every radar blip, every diplomatic reaction, and they prepared not for war, but for deterrence with teeth. The American people, watching from home, saw the footage captured by embedded journalists. They saw the raw, unfiltered power of the U.S. Navy holding the line. Comment sections filled with patriotism and pride. "This is why we serve. This is why we build the best Navy in the world." Others pointed out the stakes. Freedom of navigation, the safety of trade routes, the very idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. As the sun set over the South China Sea, the Chinese fighter jets retreated to their mainland base. The USS Mustin held its position, a silent sentinel in a sea of tension. And though not a single missile had flown, the clash of will and strategy echoed louder than gunfire. In the calm that followed, American warships continued their mission undeterred. They were not there to provoke, but to protect. The world had just witnessed a dangerous encounter, but it had also seen unwavering resolve. For every time a jet flies too close, for every attempt to intimidate, the United States stands ready, not just with might, but with the conviction that freedom, peace, and international law are worth defending every single day across every ocean.